the Executive Director of Strategic Initiatives for Cronkite, and I'm here on behalf of Dean Batts tonight to welcome you all to our event. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to our annual Paul J. Schatt Memorial Lecture. The Cronkite School established the Schatt Lecture Series in 2007 in memory of former Arizona Republic reporter, editor, and columnist Paul J. Schatt, who taught public affairs reporting to Cronkite students for more than 30 years as an adjunct faculty member. This series, in its name, is supported by the Paul J. Schatt Lecture Series Endowment, established by Paul's family and the Cronkite School. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. Our speaker for the evening is Dr. Joseph Russomanno. Dr. Russomanno is a media law scholar and professor at the Arizona State University Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication. After a decade-long career in broadcast journalism, Dr. Russomanno returned to higher education, first to earn his PhD at the University of Colorado Boulder, followed by his career at ASU and the Cronkite School that began in 1994. This second career revolves around the First Amendment, his teaching, research, writing, and publications. He approaches each of these not as separate areas, but with the idea that each enhances the others. All are parts of the same whole. As a scholar and teacher on the First Amendment and media law, Dr. Russomanno is motivated to help people not only understand their rights and obligations in these areas, but also to better grasp the political, historical, and philosophical origins and development of those rights. They are the cornerstones of not only journalism, but also of any self-governing democracy. In addition to teaching thousands of ASU students, many of whom have graduated and gone on into careers in journalism and law, Dr. Russomanno has produced nearly 24 refereed journal articles, nearly 24 conference papers, several chapters and contributions in books, nearly 40 published reviews and commentaries, and 5 books, including The Stench of Politics, Polarization and Worldview on the Supreme Court. A critical analysis of the U.S. Supreme Court, it examines various systemic challenges confronting the court and ideas addressing how to meet those challenges. Dr. Jonathan Wheeler, author and global studies professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, said this about the publication. It has become commonplace for analysis of the Supreme Court to describe the justices as politicians in robes. What has been missing, however, is a framework for understanding justices as political actors. In this highly readable and compelling examination of the Supreme Court, Joseph Russomanno fills that void. Russomanno applies the latest research on polarization and its psychological roots to interpret the worldviews of the Supreme Court's liberal and conservative members. Describing the court's conservatives as fixed originalists and its liberals as fluid, living constitutionalists, Russomanno shows how the justices reason from their core values to judicial outcomes. In doing so, he punctures the sanctified air jurors supposedly breathe, especially the alleged value-neutral framework of originalism, by making clear how much the justices' decisions flow from their political, ideological, and worldview commitments. A terrific, incisive, and sobering analysis of the High Court, end quote. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joseph Russomanno to the stage.
Thank you, Malcolm, and good evening, everyone. It's great to be here, and particularly to be part of this tradition of the Schatt Lecture. Forgive me while I change eyewear, but experience has taught me that it's much better to be able to see your notes than not see them. So here I go. So as you can tell from the title of this book, it's one about the U.S. Supreme Court, as Malcolm already described. Now, some might ask, what's a professor in a journalism school doing writing about that? What does the Supreme Court have to do with journalism? Well, the short answer is that not only are my teaching and research in the area of press and speech freedom linked to the Supreme Court, The court is the institution that's provided and reinforced the press and speech freedom that we have in America, a degree of freedom that's unlike any in the world, including even in other Western democracies. And of course, speech and press freedom have everything to do with quality journalism. It was from this Supreme Court that Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, for example, wrote that the Constitution protects freedom of thought, not only free thought for those who agree with us, but also freedom for the thought that we hate. It's where Justice Louis Brandeis changed the course of American speech law, being the first to link the value of free speech to our democracy, in piercing the notion of censorship, in writing that exposing falsehoods and fallacies is best done not by enforced silence, but by more speech. And the Supreme Court is where Justice William Brennan wrote that on public issues, that debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open. And in doing so, he redesigned libel law and freed the news media to pursue the truth in a way never before possible. And so many more examples. Now, I've been to the Supreme Court several times to see and hear First Amendment cases argued. Each time, the majesty, the gravity, the historical importance of what I was witnessing was very moving. I revere the court, or at least I once did. That was when the court tried to live up to the inscription on the front of its building, equal justice under law. It's a difficult thing when you see your Mount Olympus crumbling. This is a court where at least two members, by the way, and probably more, have in their crosshairs a 60-year-old constitutional right that helps protect press freedom, the one that I just mentioned that Justice Brennan and his colleagues created. But eliminating long-standing constitutional rights doesn't seem to bother some members of the current court. And that's one reason why national polls show that public confidence in the court has eroded significantly. Now, what else is behind this? Well, from my research, I reluctantly concluded that the court is now little more than a political institution, as political as the institution across First Street in Washington. And for those of you who need a brush up on your DC geography, I'm referring to the US Capitol building. Even worse than Congress, though, the court's members are unaccountable to the American public, installed into positions that carry with them lifetime terms. Especially when it comes to the most important issues of the day, a majority of the court, what some now refer to as a supermajority, seeks specific outcomes to benefit specific political causes. In fact, they were nominated and confirmed for that very reason. Now, in the past, there were predictions that an agenda-fueled Supreme Court would transform law with a narrow view of the Constitution. At that time, those predictions seemed far-fetched. Today, they're all too real. Within 1 week last June, for example, the court issued 4 rulings that changed the face of America. It was a turning point. Each one of those 4 rulings was a 6-3 ruling, all with the same 6 justices in the majority and the same 3 in dissent. Individually, those decisions are significant, but the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. By the end of its last term, it was clear that the court had been weaponized by those seeking outcomes. Its majority was no longer a victim of America's polarization. It was a source of the divide. As I said, what I'm sharing with you this evening is based on my research of the facts and where they led me. Some of my research employs a technique sometimes referred to as connect the dots. Uncover facts, look for patterns and connective threads, analyze the evidence, and draw conclusions. I want to assure you that I evaluated the facts as objectively as I know how. I am a trained researcher after all, and I did my best to put those skills to use. But that did not result in a set of neutral conclusions, as you can probably already tell. Instead, those facts led me to what all journalists view as sacred, the truth. Great journalists, like Mr. Schatt was, seek facts, evaluate them, and present the truth as revealed by those facts. I did the same. Within that truth, though, is a point of view. And tonight I'll share with you some of those facts and some of the conclusions I reached. So back to the Supreme Court. Is it any wonder that it's become so political? Let's consider the process by which new justices are selected. It's a political process guided by politicians and overseen by politicians. It starts with the nomination by the president. Too often the selection comes from a list provided by some interested party. To qualify for that list, it's not how well the candidate knows the law or is able to reason through it, but on his or her slant on the law. In other words, the nominee's politics. Some presidents have pulled no punches in making it clear that they want people who would rule a certain way on certain issues, not whether the nominee would carefully weigh the facts and apply the Constitution. At its conclusion, the court's last term was characterized as its most conservative in almost a century, according to one expert, relentlessly shifting to the right in a way that will transform American life. Now, to be sure, the concept of a political court is not new. The court led by Chief Justice Earl Warren in the 1950s and 60s, for example, is a frequent target. That court provided a set of rulings that reverberated in ways that may be characterized as political. But there's an important distinction between then and now. The Warren Court sought equal justice under law by expanding rights, especially for those in minority groups and those lacking power. On the other hand, decisions today, first whether to hear cases in the first place and then how to rule on them, are often motivated by the political goals of sitting justices. And typically, those rulings constrain rights, sometimes stripping away liberties previously granted by the court after years of struggle to secure them. So what's happened here? One point that I make in the book is that this is a divided court in a divided nation, and the effect that each one has on the other is significant. So how did we become so divided? Well, lots of perspectives on this, of course. The driving force of this book is something called worldview, a concept stemming in part from political science. Each of us has a worldview, and we each tend to fall into one of two categories. They're called fixed and fluid. And depending on our worldview, much of what we believe, what we value, and what we do is affected. Have you ever said to yourself about someone, that person seems to be living in a different world than I do? Well, you may be more correct than you think. It's because we have different worldviews. A lot of us see and experience the same things, but view them very differently and have conflicting beliefs about them. Worldview affects a lot, from our politics to the kinds of things we consume, like the coffee and beer brands that we choose, the cars that we drive, the restaurants that we frequent. For example, fixed worldview people are more likely to go to tried and true restaurants, ones that serve American food, by the way, whereas fluid people, who tend to be more open to new experiences, are more apt to go to hole-in-the-wall restaurants that serve ethnic cuisine. Why, you may ask? Predictable and safe versus unpredictable and somewhat risky. More on this in a bit here. So you may be asking yourself, am I fixed or am I fluid? Well, you've probably gotten some hints already. And I acknowledge here that we get into some broad strokes, but let me share with you what the literature says. Those with a fixed worldview favor the status quo or even turning back the clock to bygone eras. Fluid worldview holders are flexible and willing, even desire, to risk trying new things. Those with a fixed worldview are more likely to see the world in an either-or way, friend or foe, safe or unsafe, for example. Fluid worldview holders tend to see more nuance, more shades of gray, not black or white. And they find that acceptable, even desirable. Now, because worldview and political party identity are aligned as never before, we're polarized in ways previously unseen. In fact, worldview and party politics have aligned to the extent that it's now appropriate to draw the following associations. Fixed equals conservative or Republican. Fluid equals progressive or Democratic. Now, a minute ago, I referred to worldview's influence on consumer choices. Here's what two experts write about that. Americans make these decisions not because they're Democrats or Republicans, but because the same worldview that influences their political views also shapes their lifestyle choices. Now, there are a lot of factors that contribute to determining which worldview a person gravitates to. The most fundamental, according to the experts, is the perception of how dangerous the world is. The experts say fear is perhaps the most primal instinct, and so it's only logical that people's level of fearfulness informs their outlook on life. In short, fear is at the heart of determining into which category a person is drawn to. And for one group, fixed worldview conservatives, avoiding danger is a priority. They tend to see danger where others don't. Seeking safety is critical. Think about this as one example. Which group is most protective of the right to own guns? It's no secret that it's conservatives with a fixed worldview. Those who prioritize safety and eliminating danger. Being armed is a way to be safe. Change is another measuring stick for worldview. With change comes the unknown. Things become unpredictable, unsafe, risky. And that's something to be avoided for those with a fixed worldview. Being safe often means going back to a time when things were more predictable. The unknown is uncomfortable and generates insecurity, and fear leads to distrust. As worldview experts note, when people are wired for wariness, trust comes less easily. In the United States, this includes a wariness of a changing demographic landscape and an attraction to what's perceived to be strong, uncompromising leadership. That could make possible the rise of figures who not only challenge democratic norms, but also who would erect barriers between themselves and a changing, dangerous environment. You know, like building a wall to keep out dangerous people. So what does all this have to do with the Supreme Court? Well, over the past several decades, movements took root and grew, made up of people who believed that the nation was changing too quickly, and doing so in problematic ways. Abortion rights, school desegregation, rights for criminal defendants, voting rights, especially for minorities, separation of church and state. Not only did that change need to be stopped, it needed to be reversed. The way to do that was through the law. But the legislative path was too cumbersome, maybe even impossible. 60 votes in the Senate, 268 in the House. That wouldn't work. The votes weren't there for one reason. Neither would amending the Constitution, also requiring legislative action. But what about changing the institution that tells us what the Constitution means? The path to success for these movements was the U.S. Supreme Court. After all, you only need 5 votes. They just needed the right people to take those seats. The battle might take a long time, but they were prepared to play the long game. So related to what we've been discussing about worldview, Supreme Court justices, like all of us, are either fixed or fluid. Let's also consider a major aspect of their jobs, interpreting and applying the U.S. Constitution. And that requires deciding what the Constitution means. How do they do that? Well, there are a couple of primary methods. One is called originalism. An originalist views the Constitution's text as sacred, a fixed document, one might say, that leaves little, if any, room for nuance. It must be read and interpreted as the founders intended. Originalism developed as a reaction to the progressive rulings of the Warren Court that I referred to earlier in the 50s and 60s, and from there aligned itself with conservative politics. Originalism even appears in many Republican Party platforms, and it became a tool to justify conservative policies and court rulings. Perhaps the godfather of originalism was Justice Antonin Scalia. He believed that any other approach allows judges to mistake their own preferences for the law. The implication is that originalism is objective or neutral. It isn't. A great constitutional law scholar, Erwin Chemerinsky, writes that originalism only allows conservative justices and judges to protect that they are following a neutral theory. I should say pretend that they are following a neutral theory, when in reality they're imposing their own values. And let's not forget about worldview. Originalists champion the comfort and safety of a singular, predictable reading that better fits within a fixed worldview. One expert writes, "The problem with a judge cloaking herself in originalism is that she can then argue that she's being entirely rational and disinterested, when in fact she is deciding cases that best fit with her ideological view." Contrary to what originalism's followers advocate, it's neither neutral nor objective. Instead, it became a rallying cry for fixed originalists to justify their positions. That was enhanced by the partnership that they forged with conservative politics, with originalism used as a method to achieve conservative goals. Let's turn to the other method of constitutional interpretation, living constitutionalism. A living constitutionalist adopts an approach that begins with the same text, but also embraces the notion that its meaning and application are adaptable according to developments since the Constitution and its amendments were written. It's sort of a whole is greater than the sum of its parts approach. Take privacy law, for example. It's regarded as a right based in the Constitution, even though it's never specifically mentioned. Seeing privacy as embedded in the Constitution requires an approach like living constitutionalism. Even the authority of the Supreme Court itself is steeped in a living constitutionalism perspective. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the court is the final authority of the law, but from an 1803 ruling, the court reasoned from the structure of the Constitution that that's what was intended. And therein lies a key element, by the way, reason. It takes reasoning to determine how an 18th century document can be applied to the 21st century. But looking beyond the surface to discover meaning is often unacceptable to the originalist. To do so disturbs the comfort and safety and certainty provided by a fixed view that typically requires consideration of only the Constitution's literal meaning, if that literal original meaning can even be determined. Living constitutionalists see nuance and flexibility in the Constitution, or we might say they see the document and its interpretation as being, you guessed it, fluid. Notice, by the way, how it's easy to conclude that originalism is a fixed method. So we can coin the terms, fixed originalist and fluid living constitutionalist, and I did that in the book. I think it helps us understand the court, how it operates, how we get the rulings we do. And we see this tension between the originalists, the living constitutionalists, the fixed members, and the fluid members unfolding over and over again. So in the book, I examine the way this plays out in several specific rulings. And I wanted to use one of them here as an example, one of those that was released last June that I mentioned earlier. Now, as you can probably tell, I tend to avoid talking about controversial issues. And because I wanted to avoid anything further controversial tonight, I chose the case about abortion. Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. As you probably know, this was the ruling that overturned Roe versus Wade. The case and the court's ruling, like so many, represent a clash of worldviews. On one hand, the court's fixed originalists in the majority of 6, and on the other, the 3 dissenters who we can see by reading their opinion are fluid, living constitutionalists. This surfaces in even how the case got to the Supreme Court in the first place. Not surprisingly, it was for political reasons. A law restricting abortions was sponsored in the Mississippi State Legislature with the acknowledgement by the sponsors that it was controversial and that it was likely to be challenged in court. In fact, they wanted it to be challenged in court. That was the only way it could eventually get to the U.S. Supreme Court. On top of that, the law was introduced in Mississippi with strategic timing in mind. If it got to the Supreme Court, they wanted it to happen after new justices took the place of those who had left. They'd have the votes, reliable votes, to return to a pre-Roe era. And all of that fell into place. So, if I can figure this out. There we go, how about that? So during oral arguments in the Dobbs case, Justice Sonia Sotomayor wanted to make a point about these politics that brought the case to the Supreme Court. So let's give a listen to what she said.
Will this institution survive the stench? Will this institution survive the stench that this creates in the public perception that the Constitution and its reading are just political acts? If people actually believe that it's all political, how will we survive? How will the court survive?
Apparently, Justice Sotomayor was extremely soft-spoken that day, and I'm sure she apologizes for that. But with this quote, you can see the inspiration and origin of the book's title, and you can see a member of the court gravely concerned about the institution's credibility and therefore its durability. After all, its legitimacy depends on we, the people, believing that its processes are just. So, the Dobbs case, according to an expert, offered a vehicle that the newly empowered anti-abortion supermajority was waiting for. Another writer said the court's majority approached Dobbs with the swaggering confidence of a bloc that knows it has the votes to do whatever it wants. Justice Samuel Alito wrote the court's opinion in Dobbs with a view embedded in a literal, textual, and original approach to the Constitution. How did that reveal itself? Well, for example, he emphasized that the Constitution makes no mention of abortion. From his point of view, if it's not in the text, it shouldn't be in the law. On the other hand, the dissenters, Justices Breyer, Sotomayor, and Kagan, they called the majority's view unyielding and narrow, one that not only relies on standards of the past, but is also a perspective that regards laws, constitutional amendments, and court rulings as being fixed from the time they were written. Afterward, a Harvard law professor wrote, "In place of the living Constitution that protects liberty and equality from the tyranny of the majority, the court announced a Constitution that only protects rights that already existed in the distant past." Another issue was the 14th Amendment, which, as you may know, contains clauses that guarantee due process and equal protection under the law. Alito rejected that it could apply to this issue, consistent with his fixed originalist worldview. To even consider unwritten rights, they have to be rights that were already understood to exist in 1868 when the 14th Amendment was adopted. Do Do you suppose that abortion rights were on the minds of those who passed the 14th Amendment in 1868? Of course not. But have things changed a bit since 1868? Maybe a bit. And should the application of the Constitution change too? Maybe a bit. Excuse me. In fact, in 1868, a lot of states banned abortion. So, the Dobbs majority said, it was wrong for the Supreme Court to accept the idea of abortion rights now, just as it was wrong, they said, to accept it in 1973 when Roe versus Wade was decided. Predictably, according to my model, a polar opposite view was held by the dissenters. They wrote that applications of liberty and equality can evolve while remaining grounded in constitutional principles, constitutional history, and constitutional precedents. Let me say that again. Applications of liberty and equality can evolve while remaining grounded in constitutional principles, history, and precedents. That's what a living constitutionalist would say is at the core of a reasoned approach. There's also a question of how representative the 14th Amendment was when it was ratified. Those who passed it in 1868 hardly represented the people of their own time, much less those of today. As the Dobbs dissenters noted, the 14th Amendment's authors were white men who were not perfectly attuned to the importance of reproductive rights for women's liberty, or for their capacity to participate as equal members of our nation. Aside from the 14th Amendment, Alito also justified his fixed originalist view this way. Because it wasn't until the latter part of the 20th century, 1973, that support for a constitutional right to obtain abortion occurred, he concluded that any claim to that right doesn't meet the standard of being, in his words, deeply rooted in American history and tradition. In other words, if a right isn't old enough, then it can be dispensed with. Never mind that this was a constitutional right that was almost 50 years old. What was old enough for the Dobbs majority were standards hundreds of years old. Of course, those standards prohibited abortion, in part because of the risk to mothers. And here we have another significant weakness of originalism, over-reliance on the past, distant past, not to mention searching that past for laws that match desired outcomes today. It yields a very narrow view, and it discounts a variety of advancements across many fields since those periods, in medical practice and technology, for example. The dissenters called the court's reading of the Constitution a pinched view that uses law from the Dark Ages, and by doing so, it consigns women to second-class citizenship. Expanding on their explanation of the Constitution as a living document, the dissent added that the founders knew they were writing a document designed to apply to ever-changing circumstances over centuries. They recalled the words of one-time Chief Justice John Marshall. He wrote that the Constitution is intended to endure for ages to come and must adapt itself to a future seen dimly, if at all. The framers did understand that the world changes. They didn't define rights according to the specific practices of their time, but instead in general terms to permit future evolution in their scope and meaning. So notice what the Dobbs dissenters did. They turned originalism against the originalists, citing evidence that the founders originally intended the Constitution's meaning to evolve over time, to allow it to be responsive to new societal understandings and conditions. Now, in trying to justify the court's opinion even further, Alito noted that some of the court's most important constitutional decisions have, in fact, overruled precedent. He cited several examples. The problem was, none of them that had been overturned before were constitutionally based rights. That's what Dobbs did, and that was a first. One headline noted, Alito's message is clear. The the Supreme Court is ready to burn it all down. So what had changed in 49 years since Roe versus Wade established a constitutional right to abortion? The primary change had nothing to do with its constitutionality, but instead with the court's membership. The creation of this supermajority of justices, fixed originalists, who want to turn the clock back, in this case, to a time before Roe versus Wade. As the dissent stated, the majority overruled Roe for one and only one reason, because it always despised it, and now it had the votes to discard it. The majority, they said, substituted a rule by judges for the rule of law. So, as I've said, the conclusion here in the book is that the court has lost its way. It's now an overwhelmingly political institution, and that's just unacceptable. As we heard Justice Sotomayor articulate, it endangers the court's survival and, in turn, America's democratic republic. We, the people, deserve better. That said, what do we do about it? Well, I have some thoughts on that. Recommendations. First, as I mentioned earlier, it shouldn't be surprising that the Supreme Court has become a political institution, given that the tenure of each member begins with a highly political process, one that's controlled by politicians. It's now not uncommon for members of the Senate Judiciary Committee, the body that conducts the confirmation hearings, to use those hearings to make political points unrelated to the nominee, including relitigating previous hearings, fighting culture wars, or simply seeking attention. The most recent example of this was last March, when the hearings for Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson frequently spiraled into little more than melodramatic bombast, what one law professor called a form of political theater. This has become common, especially since these hearings have been televised live, unedited, gavel to gavel. It disgraces the process and the court itself. It damages the court's credibility at a time when it and the nation can't afford that. Now, it's documented that awareness of being observed affects behavior. And while that may increase productivity in some settings, it can also fuel attention-starved politicians who, for various reasons, have concluded that outrage, whether genuine or contrived, is a path to success. Apparently believing in P.T. Barnum's mantra that there's no such thing as bad publicity, they transformed what should be a solemn occasion into a circus. While several factors are responsible, a correlation between the presence of cameras in the hearing room, together with the growth of media platforms and the escalation of contentious behavior, is unmistakable. The cameras became triggers for grandstanding that's only enhanced with politicians' knowledge that specific behaviors will very likely be rewarded with the exposure they seek. That includes clips of their behavior finding their way to news programming. The Supreme Court itself forbids cameras. We need to do the same when it comes to the confirmation hearings for the court. Yes, that's a bold recommendation, especially from someone who advocates transparency. But I think there's no choice. The process is broken and bold steps are necessary to fix it. Now, banning cameras does not preclude news coverage of the hearings, just not the cameras. No live television where the performances are unedited. A second recommendation deals with the nomination process. The Constitution stipulates that that's in the president's hands. No getting around that. But there's no requirement about how the president is advised. It's suggested here that a bipartisan presidential commission be established. It would assume responsibilities similar to those of headhunters in business. It could be ad hoc, assembled each time a vacancy occurs on the court, or it could be a permanent commission to be established with members who have finite terms. A permanent commission could have responsibilities assigned to it in addition to those related to the Supreme Court, for example, the entirety of the federal judiciary. A public report would be required for each of its recommendations. So rather than the nomination process being directed solely by a president's political appointees and inner circle behind closed doors, this would occur outside the White House. And while the president retains the power to nominate, consistent with the Constitution, it's possible that this pre-nomination step will acquire public credibility to the extent that rejecting the commission's recommendations could create political fallout. The hope is that this would result in prioritizing the selection of outstanding jurists rather than judges with agendas who are only too happy to execute them. Now, what about the court itself? We've heard talk about term limits, and we've heard talk about expanding the court. To both, I say yes, but with some qualifications. I think they need to be considered and approved collectively. Think about the current state of lifetime appointments that Supreme Court justices get. That was intended to insulate the justices from politics. Instead, they've accomplished the opposite, become a catalyst for the court becoming politicized and contributing to the justices' lack of accountability. So, term limits can help resolve that. They should be implemented by staggering them across the court's membership and set at some determined length. 18 years has often been mentioned. Several factors are relevant to this. First, life tenure is virtually exclusive to the American federal judiciary. The United States is the only major constitutional democracy in the world that has neither a retirement age nor a fixed term for its high court justices. In this country, at the state level, almost all establish fixed terms for high court justices, ranging from 6 to 15 years. Now, there's nothing wrong with the Supreme Court being unique if there's good reason. But you have to wonder why all courts, aside from the U.S. federal courts, have concluded that limiting time on the bench is better than not doing so. Now, two additional factors surface within this discussion, one at each end of a justice's tenure on the court. First, in recent history especially, nominees are often selected according to their relative youth. That is, it's paramount whether the nominee will be able to remain on the court and exert influence for decades. Term limits would significantly diminish the importance of this factor, at the same time expanding the pool of candidates to those who can serve, for example, 18 years and not necessarily 30 or more. Second, term limits would largely eliminate the possibility of what are referred to as strategic retirements. Reportedly, for example, Justice Anthony Kennedy was persuaded to retire in 2018, in part so that a younger replacement could sustain his legacy. Now, what about expanding the court? That's the next phase of this process that hopefully helps to depoliticize the institution. The Supreme Court is the only federal court in the United States where every case is heard by every judge or justice on staff, aside from the rare recusal. And that should change. It's proposed here to first expand the court through legislation. One option that was considered by a presidential commission on the Supreme Court in 2021 was to allow an extra justice to be nominated during each of the next several four-year presidential terms. That recommendation, I think, should be followed, bringing the number of Supreme Court justices to some agreed-upon number, 13 or 15 probably. But there's a second critical step to this transformation. The court should also adopt a new internal procedure that from that pool of 13 or 15, 9 justices are chosen to hear each case. A specific selection process would be implemented, probably like what we have on our federal appeals courts, a random rotation. So we'd still have 9 justices hearing every case, just not the same 9 every time. And by spreading the burden across members of a larger group, the focus on individuals decreases, especially in the confirmation process, knowing that a particular nominee, even if confirmed, wouldn't hear and decide every case. That lowers the political temperature of that procedure. It changes the stakes. So, given that the conclusion here is that we have a court that has wrongly become a political institution, it's hoped that these recommendations would help turn the court around, returning it to its roots. What we've seen is that when politics is not only allowed, but also encouraged, the court becomes not merely a political institution, but one that loses its way, straying from its purpose. Under a regime of politics, worldview and constitutional approach are magnified, with their various traits and effects forced to the surface. Faustian bargains are made with politicians in robes who, from their nominations onward, are expected to bring about specific results, and in some cases, as I've said, are only too happy to fulfill those expectations. The Supreme Court may retain the label of court of last resort, but for a growing number of people, that signifies despair, not the hope that it once carried. The story of 20th century American constitutional law was one of bringing people who were previously excluded into the fold. We, the people, need and deserve better and should demand a Supreme Court that embraces a commitment to the rights and welfare of all the people, with all of its justices realizing that equal justice under law is more than a hollow catchphrase engraved into the building where they work. It's also a binding job description. And after all, while the Supreme Court and its work affects so many areas of American life, one of those is what we're here to celebrate with the Schatt Lecture: good journalism that's produced when it can be done free of government interference. And that comes about when the Constitution's First Amendment is read and applied properly. And with that, I will close. Thank you. So I am told that we will take questions. I will take questions. I'm happy to do so. I don't mean to say that a gun's being held in my head to do that, but I'm happy to take any questions that may be out there. Familiar face? Yes, if you would, please step to the microphone. Thank you for realizing that.
I'm so happy I get to ask you a question again. It's one of my favorite things to do in his class. I'm last semester. I'm Caden. One of the questions I had actually was just, kind of goes back to something you were talking about when you were trying to compare this Supreme Court to other countries, the highest level of their judiciary system. Is there a certain country that like sticks out to you as having like a particularly strong Supreme Court, or one that where you're like, oh, this is like a good example of like changes that we could make, or another one that you would consider like a good example of a Supreme Court that you want to see more like in our country, or are you still kind of like ours is the best, but there's changes that need to be made to it? Thank you.
You're welcome. I do not have a good answer for you, however, in spite of the quality question. Maybe it was because it was too good. I have not looked into that. That would be a great next step to take, but my work on this book and subsequently was not including anything in the way of international perspective. Hello, Keitra. How are you?
So my question was, like from what I know, like I have like a very brief history in like American history, but like politics has always been like pretty divided. I know it's been getting more divided as of late, but like there's a whole like civil war and everything like that. And so the Supreme Court, I guess like even though there's like more politics now and it's making political decisions, and it is acting as like a political institution rather than a judicial one, would you say that it's more like there's more stench now rather than later? Has the court just become more powerful and prominent, and that's why it's becoming more an issue? Or I guess that's just my question, is like, why is it such an issue now when politics has always been very polarized in the United States?
I think one reason why it has become more of an issue recently are public opinion polls showing that the credibility and legitimacy of the court is declining significantly year by year by year. And those results are based in part and primarily in people losing confidence because they don't feel that just rulings are coming from the court. They feel that most of the justices are being guided by political ideals rather than approaching cases with objectivity and neutrality. I would also point to Justice Sotomayor's comment. That shook the earth for those who follow this area, okay? That was very significant. We don't hear that sort of comment typically from a Supreme Court justice, whether it's in the written opinion or in the oral arguments, as that one was, that extreme self-criticism, criticism of the process, not her criticizing herself, but of criticizing the process that this case was brought clearly for political purposes. And you can see in her quote that she's concerned about how that is affecting the citizenry and the confidence that they need to have in the court, in all of our institutions, because when that is lost, then we are opening the door to anarchy, chaos. What happens when the people decide we're not going to follow the law anymore? There aren't enough law enforcers to keep us in mass in line. We the people have, there's a social contract where we've agreed that what our courts decide, while we're free to disagree with it, and we often do, we still abide by it. We may try to change it, even if we disagree, but we still recognize that it is the law. So I think there are a lot of factors, and those are some of them.
Thank you.
Hi.
Uh-oh.
So I have a couple of questions. In your research, when did you find that the court began to be more fixed or fluid? So, at what point in history did this begin to happen, and when did you find this?
Again, I have to say, I don't know exactly the answer to your question. I don't know when it began. My analysis, some of the content of the book goes back to Roe versus Wade in 1973, goes back to 20th century gun rights laws, voting rights laws, and we see it present there. Okay. But I think this more strict divide is of relatively recent vintage, because, as I was indicating, a lot of what we have seen happen has been a reaction, a pushback, starting with those who were unhappy with the Warren Court rulings in the 1950s and 60s.
Okay, so in 1973, when Roe was passed, was the majority of the court fixed or fluid, in your opinion?
I haven't analyzed that, but I think it's probably safe to speculate that most of it would have been fluid. There was a living constitutionalism approach at that time. Roe v. Wade was 7-2.
Okay, all right. So that basically indicates that there's probably implicit bias in the court, and it's probably been there, and it's probably going to be there. But I do have a question specifically related to the quote from Justice Sotomayor when she said, "If people believe it's all political, how will we survive?" Have you given much thought to that? How will we survive?
Well, it links with what I was saying in response to the previous question. I mean, the social contract that we have agreed as a society to abide by, the terms of that contract, so to speak, will have been violated. And then, when you see the rules of society starting to go out the window, then it opens the door to a variety of things that I think most would agree are undesirable and unwanted, up to and including authoritarian figures assuming various political offices, including high office,
Thank you.
of course.
Hi.
Hi, Peyton.
Well, firstly, I just wanted to thank you. I was expecting just some extra credit, but I feel very enlightened by this conversation. And I
Do you
know
want to trade the enlightenment for extra credit?
Yeah.
You were so enlightened, you're willing to forego the extra credit.
Yes, exactly. I don't even need it.
Mm.
Because I know you said like these topics are really controversial to talk about, but I appreciate that you did want to speak about it. Because I just wasn't expecting the conversation to go that way, because I know you like to be super objective in the way that you present class. So I really enjoyed your presentation. My first question is if you had any recommendations for how the 9 out of the 13 to 15 judges would be selected to view a case.
Purely random rotation.
Okay, so not based off of like political affiliation or anything like that?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
That would defeat the purpose.
Right. My second question was, besides your obviously burning passion for media law, what your like inspiration was for researching the court and writing the book.
So I'll try to be concise with that. I began a research project about polarization in America. It wasn't going to be specifically about the Supreme Court. And as I began that and got that underway, a couple of things became apparent. One is that I could probably spend the rest of my life researching that and not have a definitive product because it's such a huge issue with so many tentacles. The second thing I realized very quickly is that I was becoming incredibly depressed in trying to research polarization and the divide in America, and I had to stop, or else, I wasn't certain about the future of my mental health. And so I stepped away from that, and shortly thereafter sort of reassessed what I wanted to do. And, as so many people do, you turn to what you know or what you want to know more about things that you think you know. And so that brought me to the Supreme Court, and some of the reading that I had done, some of the research that I had already done. I said this was going to be concise, didn't I? Some of the reading I had already done in that first step of the research, I had thought, boy, this feels like it could apply to the Supreme Court, and it would be fun to try to see just how well it applies. So that's what I began to do on this second go around, and things just started falling into place. I mean, the puzzle pieces very quickly turned into a clear picture, at least from my point of view. But as I said, I did not initially intend this to be a book. It was going to be, it was research, and I didn't know what the final product would be. But it grew, and to the extent where I thought, I think this is a book.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Joe. Congratulations on the book and your research. Very, very, very nicely presented.
Thanks.
So, obviously very clear that the originalists have breached the castle walls. And I'm curious whether in your research you view this as the sort of high watermark of originalism, or will there be a counter movement the other direction as there was with originalism and the Warren Court, 50 years ago?
I think the battle lines have been drawn. It's unfortunate to have to characterize it that way, but I think that's the reality. I do think it's between the originalists and the living constitutionalists. I know these battles are going on many levels today, including in the academic world. I became part of that debate unknowingly about a month ago, but just to cite the fact that I know that's going on. So as I said, I think those two camps are what we have, and it's just going to be, unless there are some of the kinds of reforms that I and others are talking about, I think my guess is we're stuck in that, and it's just who has the numbers.
Yeah.
We're 6-3 right now on the court. We'll see how that changes. We'll see if anybody is leaving the court soon due to corruption charges or anything like that. Not naming any names, of course.
Yeah.
Just hypothetically speaking.
Right.
Someone you know
Yeah.
of quite well.
Quite well.
Speaking of books,
Right.
my colleague here has written a book on Justice Thomas, just in case no one knew that's what we were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that was clear to me in the research that I did on Thomas, and of course I had to get smart about originalism when I did that research, is that conservatives, fixed, mindset folks were extremely, extremely strategic and deliberate about how they went about vetting and assembling lists of potential jurists, not initially the Supreme Court, but to get them on federal courts, and then to the Supreme Court, ultimately. And I don't know whether there's an equivalent kind of strategic initiative on the living constitutionalists and the way they are or could be approaching getting people of a different mindset confirmed to the court.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The originalists and that whole group, much more organized, much more, as I indicated, ready, willing, and able to play the long game. I mean, they started this in 1973. When Roe was decided.
And these was, all these guys were.
And they were, their whole idea was. Obviously, they have other issues too, but number one on the agenda was to overturn Roe, and they did it. I'm reminded of was it Mark Twain or Will Rogers, one of those folks who said, I'm not a member of a organized political party. I'm a Democrat, I think that's the right has always been far more organized and far more able to tap into what needs to be done to make it happen.
Right. Thank you.
Nikki?
Are we out of time? Can I ask a question still? Okay, good. So I really thought it was interesting how you framed everything around these worldviews that, to me, read as state-level features about a person, right? These are probably grown and adapted and have become a stronghold. And so kind of going to Caden's question, when we think about the stench of this, and this question kind of goes to, right, is there true objectivity, right? Or is everything infused with our worldview and we're just pretending like it doesn't? Have you noticed, and so when you answered his question, you kind of took it from the consumer, the people's perspective, right? They view it as more political. They view that there's less trust in the Supreme Court. Did you look, though, at whether the Supreme Court justices, in their communication, whether they're being more, they're shedding that perspective of objectivity, or that they're not political in a way? Are they being more forward in their stances of being political? Does that question make sense?
Yes. Yes and no. Good night, everybody. You in the maybe 2 years leading up to Dobbs and that whole group of rulings, you had Supreme Court justices, as you probably know, rarely speak publicly. But when they were doing so a little bit more often and consistently, especially those on the right, consistently saying, we are objective, in so many words. We do not have an agenda. we're sorry if you don't like the way rulings turn out, but that's the way it goes sometimes, and both sides are unhappy over various rulings and have been for decades. Yet, in spite of that, right after they would say that, then you get hints, maybe more than hints, in what they said in those speaking engagements that indicated otherwise. It was often interesting, too, where they were speaking. What kind of event were they speaking at? Rarely, if ever, was it at something that was neutral or even left-oriented. It was always at conservative organizations and rallies. I recall one example of these that I'm thinking of was Amy Coney Barrett speaking at a function that Senator Mitch McConnell was running. Of course, and there are other things besides speaking engagements. Some justices have written books. Some before they got on the bench wrote law review articles. To me, though, and I'm kind of saving what I think is the best for last, the ultimate measuring stick is their opinions for the court. And again, as I was doing this project and putting it together, I was astounded to the extent that this lined up just as I and other scholars would have predicted. I mean, you look in those rulings, and I've done this in the book of pulling out quotes and laying them out in hopefully coherent ways that very clearly illustrate the points that I'm making here, and they're not shying away from the points of view that they have. I will say, as an addendum to that, though, I do think the supermajority conservatives are a bit more subtle in how they try to lay this out. They try to justify what they're doing. And I think a casual reader would look at this and say, oh, that makes sense. Yeah, I can buy into that. But it's straight from the playbook of the fixed worldview conservative originalist. Thank you, everyone.